Bro, I remember the blackness of people and having been copying, everyone just rushed to it because they want to see it. And that's pancakes and waffles, which are so good. I mean, that was cool though, but like literally, like, I was doing some work, I was like, Ayush, it was cool in 5 minutes. I'm getting seal credit. National University of Singapore. Never heard that. Oh wait,
Yeah, they have a drawing program there.
oh that's
We're
where.
pretty significant ties with them.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's from. What was it? I think there's a good concept out there. I think. Sure,
Maybe what?
good concept program over there.
Likely
Yeah,
on program.
they're talking about that. Actually, wouldn't want to go. I would want to go to Singapore and see like a good country to go to. In terms of culture and a very well country too. What's that?
I'm still reading it.
Well, I think
I
actually
I have a weird thing where like sometimes I read.
I will be on the Reddit for the year. But
So I
don't
read it the
think,
first time. but I
like
haven't.
looking at Reddit.
Oh.
the program.
BSEA.
It was an interesting topic.
I don't want to take money if I can't do it, you know what I mean?
Why?
Like, it's a good reason to know.
Yeah, but.
It's a very important topic. So I was like, sorry, Jack, I was kind of nervous to write about it. I didn't ask you, but it's like not. You can.
Yeah, it's also more contemporary than most things I read. So it's all.
Sure.
You just keep forgetting.
I like these kind of assignments where I read 12 different essays as opposed to like 50 of the same essays. So.
Just introduce you. The international order and how like state is reflected in
I'm the one person in my
history. Idiots.
I mean, I guess a lot of my friends did it earlier. And
Really
I might as well too. Just do it. It's a dude. Well, my event is due, I think, on 28th. But given that though, every single one counts, and I don't have any. Which is fair.
That is very, very.
That was thinking on
This is my only chance. My only chance to.
Okay, like you're saying.
For all the procrastination and
like the
dealing with.
on Pesach Eve, actually that on the Pesach night, so they were like meditate, we'll go through the next morning.
Wow, that's interesting.
So I think we'll go ahead and get started. So thanks to everybody for coming. Before I forget to mention it, if you are an undergrad that needs CLE credit, there's a sheet you can scan by the door. So do that before you leave. You need to. I'm so excited you all are here. I'm really excited about this talk. So I will briefly introduce our speaker and then just turn it over to him. So Jack Chia is an assistant professor of history and religious studies at the National University of Singapore. He's a historian of religion whose research focuses on Buddhism and Chinese popular religion. He specializes in Buddhism in maritime Southeast Asia and has broader research interests in migration, diasporas, transnationalism, pilgrimage, and religious diplomacy. And we were just talking about his research interests over dinner, and they are indeed expansive. He's the author of Monks in Motion, Buddhism and Modernity Across the South China Sea, which was awarded the 2021 Euroseas Humanities Book Prize and shortlisted for the 2023 Friedrich Weller Prize. This book was recently translated into Indonesian under a title in Indonesian, which I will not attempt to read for you. And a Chinese translation is underway. Chia is currently working on two book projects, Sisters in Dharma, a Buddhist feminist in post-colonial Indonesia, and Diplomatic Dharma, Buddhist diplomacy in modern Asia, which is supported by the 2020 Social Science and Humanities Research Fellowship awarded by the Social Science Research Council, Singapore. In 2022, he was elected a Fellow of the Royal Historical Society. And he's also a friend of mine. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce Jack Chia for what is South China Sea Buddhism.
Thank you, Becky, for the really generous introduction. Colleagues and friends, a very good evening to all of you. Thank you to Becky and the team at the Carolina Asia Center for the effort in putting together today's event. I'm deeply honored to be invited to serve as a speaker for the Bringing Southeast Asia Home Speaker Series, a wonderful initiative which brings together scholars of the US Southeast and from the National University of Singapore. So I'm really truly honored to be here. As a Southeast Asianist from Southeast Asia, teaching in Southeast Asia, I want to start my talk with a little life story. Born and raised in Singapore, I would say that my childhood experiences and education pretty much shaped my interest in Asian history and Buddhist studies. When I was little, both my parents left me in the care of my maternal grandmother, who was a migrant from Xiamen, China. She was a Buddhist and often brought me to Chinese temples to participate in religious festivals and ceremonies. I learned a lot about Buddhism and Chinese religious practices, as well as the Hokkien dialect from her. When I was in high school, which we call junior college in Singapore, I joined a Buddhist recitation group and learned Chinese Buddhist liturgical chants. Subsequently, my friends and I established the first Buddhist rock band in Singapore. Yeah, so, and guess what? We were featured in the local Chinese news. So you can imagine how much fun we had. My undergraduate education as a history major at the National University of Singapore further inspired my interest in Buddhism, Chinese history, and Southeast Asian history. That was when I came across Sichuan Fa's book, A History of the Development of Buddhism in Singapore, or 新加坡佛教发展史. After reading the book, I was fascinated by how Chinese migration contributed to the spread of Buddhism from China to Singapore. I was deeply inspired to find out about the issues surrounding Chinese Buddhism and the religious connections between China and Southeast Asia. And the rest is history. The Malay archipelago, oftentimes referred to as maritime Southeast Asia, consists of Muslim-majority Indonesia, Malaysia, and Brunei, Catholic Philippines, and Chinese Buddhist-majority Singapore. In earlier times, this region saw the rise and fall of several Hindu-Buddhist kingdoms, followed with the arrival of Islam in the Malay archipelago during the 13th century, leading to large-scale conversion of the population to Islam. By the 20th century, Islam is the religion of approximately 140 million people in Southeast Asia, concentrated in the Malay archipelago. Indonesia, in fact, has the world's largest Muslim population. Singapore, where I come from, has stood out in the maritime world of Southeast Asia for its Chinese and Buddhist majority population. Buddhism in maritime Southeast Asia during modern times has little or nothing to do with the early Hindu-Buddhist kingdoms of Sriwijaya, Satyendra, and Majapahit. The majority of Buddhists in present-day Indonesia, Malaysia, and Singapore are ethnic Chinese who migrated to Southeast Asia or were born to the immigrant parents in the 19th and 20th centuries. Unknown to many, perhaps, a prominent feature in the Chinese migration to maritime Southeast Asia was the dissemination and development of Buddhism in the diaspora. However, the term Southeast Asian Buddhism calls to mind Theravada Buddhism, the dominant religion in the mainland Southeast Asian states of Burma, Cambodia, Laos, and Thailand. While Vietnam is considered a part of mainland Southeast Asia, Vietnamese Buddhism, which mostly belongs to the Mahayana tradition, is often regarded as a part of East Asian Buddhism, which is based on the Chinese language canon and is widely practiced in China, Japan, and Korea. In contrast, maritime Southeast Asia conjures the image of the Malay archipelago, consisting of the Muslim majority states of Indonesia, Malaysia, and Brunei, as well as the predominantly Catholic Philippines. Singapore is deemed an anomaly because of the predominant Buddhist and Chinese population. Scholars of Southeast Asia tend to highlight the cultural and historical differences between mainland and maritime Southeast Asia by emphasizing the religious contrast between mainland Theravada Buddhism and maritime Islam and Catholicism to conceptualize the religious diversity of Southeast Asia as a region. In doing so, these studies fail to recognize the presence of Buddhism in maritime Southeast Asia and its significance among Chinese communities in the predominantly Islamic and Catholic region.
Right.
On the other hand, scholars of Buddhism have often limited the study of Southeast Asian Buddhism to the Theravada Buddhist majority on the mainland. For instance, Donna Scherer's seminal work that you see over here, The Buddhist World of Southeast Asia, focuses only on Theravada Buddhism in Myanmar, Thailand, Laos, and Cambodia, while Anne Hansen's article on modern Buddhism in Southeast Asia recognizes the presence of a vibrant Chinese Buddhist minority in Malaysia at the end of her essay. In other words, previous scholarship has considered the category of Southeast Asian Buddhism to be almost synonymous with Theravada Buddhism. There are three possible reasons to explain the dichotomy between mainland Theravada Buddhism and maritime Islam and Catholicism in the study of Southeast Asia. First, this could be attributed to the historiography of writing nation-state histories of Southeast Asia. Scholars of Southeast Asian Buddhism and historians of Southeast Asia generally tend to write the narrative of Southeast Asian countries in a linear fashion, from early modern Buddhist kingdoms to modern Buddhist majority nation states. The narrative of the evolution of Buddhist kingdoms neglects the Chinese presence and the connectivity of Buddhist monks across the South China Sea. A second reason could be the form of Buddhism in maritime Southeast Asia. The majority of Buddhists in Indonesia, Malaysia, and Singapore are ethnic Chinese following Mahayana Buddhism. Therefore, scholars of Buddhism in maritime Southeast Asian states tend to come from a background of sinology and East Asian Buddhist studies, and to consider Chinese Buddhism in Southeast Asia as an extension of Chinese Buddhism rather than as Southeast Asian Buddhism. Additionally, many of them publish their work in Chinese, making them inaccessible to scholars of Southeast Asia who don't read the language. Third, and closely related to the second reason, academic boundaries and institutional limitations create a gap between scholars trained in Southeast Asian Buddhism and in East Asian Buddhism. While scholars of Southeast Asian Buddhism are linguistically trained in Pali in mainland Southeast Asian languages, students of East Asian Buddhism usually study Chinese, Japanese, Korean, and a modern European research language. So in other words, to become a scholar of Buddhism, you need to learn many languages. And that's what I always tell my students. For this reason, scholars of Southeast Asian Buddhism are equipped with country-specific linguistic and cultural knowledge under the assumption that they will be studying Theravada Buddhism on the mainland. My lecture today will discuss Chinese Buddhist migration in the 20th century. I will also tell the connected history of Buddhist communities in China and maritime Southeast Asia. I will present the intellectual and institutional history of Buddhism in China and in Indonesia, Malaysia, and Singapore through the lives and career of three prominent monks that you see over here, Zhu Mo, Yan Pei, and Asing Jarakita. I demonstrate how their education, travels, monastic affiliations, and interaction with the post-colonial nation state have contributed to the emergence of a field of belief and practice that I call South China Sea Buddhism. By South China Sea Buddhism, I refer to the forms of Buddhism in maritime Southeast Asia, which use Mandarin Chinese, Southern Chinese dialects, and Southeast Asian languages in their liturgy and scriptures that have emerged out of Buddhist connections across the South China Sea. In coining the term South China Sea Buddhism, I draw on M. Blackburn's work on Indian Ocean Buddhism. In sketching out an intellectual case for Indian Ocean Buddhism, Blackburn emphasizes the connected history of Buddhist communities in South and Southeast Asia. I find the idea of Indian Ocean Buddhism, a term Blackburn used to analyze Buddhist mobility and networks across regions, helpful to my discussion of monastic migration and transnational networks between China and maritime Southeast Asia. I will tell a history of monastic institutional connectivity in the South China Sea during the 20th century, which emerged due to Chinese migration and to larger forces of social political changes that took place in China and in Southeast Asia. My research into South China Sea Buddhism is propelled by three questions. Why did Buddhist monks migrate from China to Southeast Asia? How did they participate in transregional Buddhist networks across the South China Sea? What were the broader implications of these Buddhist connections? In addition to presenting Zhu Mo, Yan Pei, and Asing Jarakita's ideas, activities, and projects, my lecture has two aims. First, we will highlight the connected history of Buddhist communities in China and Southeast Asia through synthesizing institutional and intellectual history, as well as global and local history. My focus is how migrant monks acted as agents of knowledge production in the process of selective reformation of Chinese Buddhism by reconfiguring Buddhist idea through contestation and negotiation. Second, I hope to challenge conventional categories of Chinese Buddhism and Southeast Asian Buddhism by focusing on the lesser known, yet no less historically significant Chinese Buddhist communities in maritime Southeast Asia. I demonstrate that Chinese migration contributed to the spread of Buddhism and establishment of new Buddhist institutions in the diaspora. My lecture is divided into 4 parts. First, I will explore Chinese migration to maritime Southeast Asia between the 19th and the first half of the 20th century, explaining how the overseas Chinese came to play a significant role in spreading Buddhism from China to the Malay archipelago. Second, I will examine the transnational religious career of Zhu Mo, examining his activities and religious spaces in Malaysia during the second half of the 20th century. Next, I will focus on the case of Yan Pei, reviewing how Singapore's Buddhist history was intertwined with the larger history of migration and modernization of Chinese Buddhism. Finally, I will discuss Asing Jarakita's attempt to make Buddhism less Chinese in order to safeguard the survival of Buddhism as a minority religion in Muslim-majority Indonesia. Large-scale Chinese migration began in the mid-19th century and lasted through the 1930s. This massive movement of the Chinese population could be attributed to both the push factors within China and the pull factors in Southeast Asia. Qing China's defeat in the Opium War and the subsequent signing of unequal treaties had important consequences on Chinese migration to Southeast Asia. In essence, colonialism in Southeast Asia, coupled with the Western opening of China, created the mechanism for moving Chinese labor from South China to Southeast Asia. Chinese migrants were active agents in spreading numerous deity cults into Southeast Asia. For many migrants, the long journey to foreign lands filled them with a deep sense of anxiety and uncertainty, prompting them to turn towards religious belief and practices, which not only fulfill the spiritual needs of the migrants, but also enhanced their confidence and gave them a greater sense of security in a new work and living environment in colonial Southeast Asia. The Empress of Heaven, which they see over here, Tian Hou, also known as Ma Zhu, was probably the most popular goddess in the Chinese diaspora, given her popular regard as protector of seafarers. At the same time, local native place deities such as Guangzhe Zunwang, over here, and Qingshui Zhusi, that were peculiar and significant to specific deity groups and locales also accompanied the Chinese migrants to Southeast Asia. The overseas Chinese communities worship these deities for a variety of reasons, including others like longevity, fertility, marriage, promotion, and protection. As revealed in a number of sources, overseas Chinese did not distinguish Buddhist deities from Chinese local gods, and they worship these sacred images by lighting candles and joss sticks. Many Chinese migrants venerated the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas along with Taoist deities and practiced the Confucian rite of ancestor worship. This form of pre-institutional Chinese Buddhism, which some scholars call the unity of the three teachings of Confucianism, Buddhism, and Taoism, was common among the overseas Chinese in Southeast Asia. Furthermore, Chinese merchants, not Buddhist monks, were responsible for running Buddhist temples in the host country prior to the last decade of the 19th century. The early Chinese migrant monks who resided and performed religious ceremonies in the temples were less educated and could barely understand the meaning of the Buddhist scriptures in classical Chinese. The institutional form of Chinese Buddhism only appeared in maritime Southeast Asia during the last decade of the 19th century. By institutional Buddhism, I refer to Buddhism as an organized religion with a system of teachings, rituals, clerics, and organizations. The arrival of educated Chinese monks in the Malay archipelago contributed to the institutionalization of Buddhism and the subsequent monastery building efforts among the overseas Chinese communities. Moreover, unlike their predecessors, who were primarily ritual specialists, this new breed of migrant monks who received their monastic training in China were concerned with the dissemination of Buddhist doctrines to the overseas Chinese. Between the second half of the 19th and the first half of the 20th century, social political changes in China gave rise to a Buddhist modernist movement, which in turn contributed to the making of vibrant South China Sea Buddhist networks. In a nutshell, the Buddhist modernist movement in China during the early half of the 20th century was characterized by reform of the leadership system in the Buddhist monasteries, founding of Buddhist research institutions, as well as lay and women's organizations, publishing of Buddhist periodicals, printing and distribution of free Dharma books, and opening of Buddhist libraries, setting up of Buddhist academies, and the promotion of Buddhist charitable activities. These Buddhist reformers participated in the kind of modernist projects as defined by Anne Hansen and David McMahon, making claims of the relevance of Buddhist doctrines to the issues of the time and promoted Buddhism based on national particularity. Hai Xu, as you see on the slide, was one of the most prominent figures among the Chinese Buddhist modernists during the Republican period. Born in 1890 in the Chongde County of Zhejiang Province, he became a novice in Jiangsu and received his higher ordination at the Tiantong Monastery in Ningbo. After the founding of the Chinese Republic in 1911, Hai Xu spearheaded the Buddhist revival movement and advocated for the need to reform the monastic system and promote education. He advocated human life Buddhism, or 人生佛教, to revitalize Chinese Buddhism. His ideas of human life Buddhism were aimed at changing the existing image and understanding of Buddhism as a religion for the dead, to emphasized the practice of Buddhism for this worldly life, addressing the social and spiritual problems of 20th century China. Under the embassy of Taixu, Nanputuo Monastery became a headquarters for the Buddhist modernist movement in Southeast China, and it was a key nodal point in the networks connecting modernist monks in South China and the overseas Chinese communities in Southeast Asia. The South China Sea Buddhist networks were crucial in the transregional circulations of people, ideas, and resources within China and Southeast Asia. The religious connections, on the one hand, facilitated the movement of Buddhist monks from China to Southeast Asia and fostered the dissemination of Buddhist modernist ideas to the overseas Chinese communities. On the other hand, the networks were used to transfer resources from Southeast Asia to fund religious activities in China. For instance, as the abbot of Nanputuo Monastery, Taixu made 3 visits to Singapore in 1926, 1928, and 1940 to leverage on the South China Sea networks to seek donation from overseas Chinese to fundraise for his renovation projects for Nanputuo Monastery, as well as to fund his education reforms at the Minnan Buddhist Institute. During his first visit in 1926, that's the screensaver that just came out. During his first visit in 1926, Taixu met with several prominent Chinese businessmen and became friends with Tan Ha-Ki and Ao Bun Ho. Taixu's friendship with these influential local Chinese leaders demonstrates the significance of the transregional South China Sea networks, allowing him to seek financial support from wealthy business elites in the diaspora and opportunities to preach his ideas of human life Buddhism to them. The arrival of modernist Buddhist ideas further contributed to the institutionalization of Chinese Buddhism in maritime Southeast Asia during the first half of the 20th century. Taixu had ambitious plans to spread his ideas of human life Buddhism beyond China and wanted to organize an ecumenical Buddhist movement to extend the reach of his modernist project. In September 1926, Taixu came to Singapore and gave a series of talks at the Victoria Memorial Hall, which attracted a large crowd of overseas Chinese. As most of the Buddhist monasteries in Singapore during the early 20th century were disconnected from the laity, Taixu suggested the establishment of a lay Buddhist association, which would be beneficial in propagating the Dharma to the overseas Chinese community. This proposal inspired Ning Dayun, a prominent Buddhist householder who founded the Chinese Buddhist Association a year later with assistance from Zhuan Dao in 1927. The Chinese Buddhist Association became an important institution for the promotion of Buddhist modernist movement in Singapore by providing education and welfare services for the overseas Chinese communities. By the turn of the 20th century, the development of institutional Buddhism in maritime Southeast Asia was linked to and enabled by broader events in China. By the end of the 1940s, there was a larger presence of Buddhist organizations in maritime Southeast Asia. We will now look at the development of Buddhism in the region and the ways in which Zhu Mo, Yan Pei, and Asing Jarakita promoted their respective form of Buddhist modernism in the Chinese diaspora. Today, many Malaysian Buddhists consider Zhu Mo to be the father of Malaysia's Chinese Buddhism. In 1913, Chen De'an, who became Zhu Mo, was born near the foot of Mount Yandang in the Leching County of Zhejiang Province. He became a monk when he was 12 and later enrolled at the Minnan Buddhist Institute in Xiamen at the Nanputuo Monastery, where he became a student of Taixu. Following the Communist Party's victory and the establishment of the People's Republic of China in 1949, many Chinese monks feared communist hostility towards religion and hence decided to leave mainland China. Zhu Mo first left for Macau, which was under Portuguese rule, to become the founding advisor of the Macau Buddhist Society. In 1954, he migrated to Penang and remained in Malaysia until his death in 2002. During his 5-decade religious career in Malaysia, he served as an advisor to the Porte School, founded and served as the inaugural president of the Malaysian Buddhist Association, established the Triple Wisdom Hall, and started the Malaysian Buddhist Institute. In 1998, Zumo became the first Buddhist monk in Malaysia to receive the title Datuk from the head of state of Penang for his contributions to Buddhism and education. Zumo redefined the basis of being Buddhist in Malaysia by drawing on Tai Chu's reformist ideas of human life Buddhism. He encouraged intra-religious conversion by advocating a Malaysian Chinese Buddhist identity that emphasized this worldly practice of Buddhism, promoted a vision of Buddhist orthodoxy, which he called 真性佛教, and established new Buddhist institutions for the promotion of religious education. By examining the Malaysian context with the idea of South China Sea Buddhism in mind, we are able to see the connected history of Buddhist communities in China and maritime Southeast Asia. Chinese Buddhist migration has contributed to a redefinition of the concept of being Buddhist in Malaysia and created a Malaysian Chinese Buddhist identity based on the idea of human life Buddhism. When Zumo first migrated to Penang, the majority of Malaysian Chinese knew little about Buddhist doctrines and practiced a mix of Buddhist, Taoist, and Chinese popular religious practices, which I mentioned earlier. Furthermore, Buddhism was commonly associated with death and funeral rites. Zumo advocated for national Buddhist identity based on the principle of human life Buddhism, stressing the need to incorporate Buddhism into one's life, practice orthodox Buddhism, and take refuge in the triple gems, the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha. In other words, he wanted to invent a new definition of being Buddhist for the Malaysian Buddhist community. To promote Buddhist education, Zumo contributed to the expansion of the Porte School and established the Malaysian Buddhist Association, Triple Wisdom Hall, and Malaysian Buddhist Institute, which were crucial in disseminating doctrinal knowledge and facilitating intra-religious conversion among the Buddhist community in Malaysia. Next, we will look at Yen Pei. Singaporean Buddhists generally remember Yen Pei as a scholar, social worker monk, responsible for bringing the ideas of humanistic Buddhism or 人间佛教 to Southeast Asia and promoting them in his lectures, writings, and social activism. Most of his writings were published in a 34-volume collection entitled Collected Works of Mindful Observation and a 12-volume sequel entitled A Sequel to the Mindful Observation, making him the most prolific Chinese Buddhist writer of the period in Southeast Asia. Yen Pei was born in 1917 into a poor farming family in the Yangzhou city in Jiangsu province. In 1929, he was ordained as a monk. Yen Pei was very much a product of the Buddhist modernist movement in Republican China. Like many of his contemporaries, such as Zumo, Yen Pei received formal monastic training at Buddhist seminaries, where he was influenced by Tai Chu's vision of human life Buddhism and Ying Shun's ideas of humanistic Buddhism. Following the communist victory and the establishment of the People's Republic of China in 1949, Yen Pei left China for Hong Kong and later settled in Taiwan with his teacher and friend, Ying Shun. So that's Ying Shun and that's Yen Pei, and they were among the founding monks of the Fuyan Vihara in Taiwan. During Yen Pei's decade-long career in Taiwan, between 1952 and 1964, he made 3 trips to Southeast Asia. In 1958, 1961 and 1964, where he contributed to the conversations between Theravada and Mahayana Buddhist monastics and established connections with the Southeast Asian Buddhist communities. Yen Pei initially wanted to migrate and spread Buddhism in Vietnam, but was unable to do so because of the Vietnam War. In 1964, he came to Singapore and spent the remaining 32 years of his life building a Buddhist community in post-colonial Singapore. His religious career in Singapore can be divided into two phases. The first as the abbot of the Ling Fong Rajna Auditorium from 1964 to 1979, and subsequently as a social activist and founding chairman of the Singapore Buddhist Welfare Services from 1980 to his death in 1996. During the first phase of his career, Yen Pei was concerned with the lack of Dharma activities in Singapore. He built a modern-looking auditorium that you see over here, and pioneered activities such as weekly Dharma lectures, group practices, and Sunday school, which were uncommon among Buddhist organizations during that time. Yen Pei also relied on his networks to make his auditorium a nodal point in the global Buddhist networks, thus allowing him to invite monks from Asia, Australia, and even North America to visit and speak to his congregation. The publication and circulation of his collected work of mindful observation earning him a reputation as one of the preeminent scholar monks of Chinese Buddhism in the region. In the second phase of his religious career in Singapore, Yen Pei became a social activist and founded the Singapore Buddhist Welfare Services. He was actively engaged with secular social issues that were of concern in Singaporean society. Yen Pei's Buddhist Welfare Services played an important role in promoting elder care and filial piety, organ donation and kidney dialysis, and drug prevention and rehabilitation against the backdrop of a rapidly developing Singapore. Yen Pei preached Buddhist doctrines to not only justify the need for Singaporean Buddhists to be socially relevant and contribute to social welfare, but also went so far as to say that Buddhist teachings could be used as practical solutions to addressing national issues. The government awarded Yen Pei the Public Service Medal in 1986 and the Public Service Star in 1992 to recognize his contributions to social welfare and medical services. And now let us turn our attention to our third monk, Asing Jarakita. Widely regarded as the first Indonesian-born Buddhist monk, Asing Jarakita took it as his mission to propagate Buddhism in the archipelago nation. His Buddhayana movement, which combined the doctrines and practices of Mahayana and Theravada Buddhism, established an inclusive and non-sectarian Buddhist community. Asing Jarakita crafted a vision of Indonesian Buddhism, which he called Agama Buddha Indonesia, as a diverse yet unified religion in line with the motto of unity in diversity of the modern Indonesian nation. Later, he introduced the concept of Sankyang Apit Buddha to make Buddhism compatible with the first principle of Panchansila, the 5 philosophical pillars of Indonesia during the New Order period. Asing Jarakita was born in 1923 in Bogor, a city in West Java, at the time part of the Dutch colony of the East Indies. He was given the name Di Bong An by his Chinese immigrant parents. His early exposure to Buddhism at Chinese temples or klenteng were primarily through chanting and vegetarianism. And according to him, in his biography, that his parents were against the idea of being a vegetarian. Unlike Zhu Mo and Yen Pei, who were born in China, Asing Jarakita was a Peranakan Chinese born and raised in the Dutch East Indies. He was educated in the Dutch colonial education system and later studied chemistry in the Netherlands. In 1953, Di Bong An was ordained as a novice at Gong Hock Si in Jakarta by Ben Ching, where he was given the Dharma name Tizhen. After several months of monastic training, Tizhen decided to seek higher ordination to become a bhikkhu. The lack of the required number of months for the transmission of precepts, however, make it impossible for him to be fully ordained in Indonesia. Therefore, Tizhen planned to seek higher ordination in the Chinese Mahayana tradition in mainland China, but was unable to do so as religious activities were restricted under the communist regime. Consequently, Tizhen was reordained and received his higher ordination in the Theravada tradition under Mahasi Sayadaw in Burma, who gave him the name Jinarakita. Unlike his contemporaries in Malaysia and Singapore, who sought to spread ideas of Buddhist modernism among the Chinese community, Asing Jinarakita tried to make Buddhism less Chinese as a calculated strategy to ensure the survival of Buddhism as a minority religion in the world's largest Muslim nation. He founded the Buddhayana movement that promoted non-sectarian doctrines and practices to be in line with the national discourse of unity in diversity. The Buddhayana movement conceptualizes Buddhism as a religion within 3 concentric circles that you see over here. The innermost circle, which is the core teaching or iti ajaran, and the liberating dimension of Buddhism. The next circle is method, which according to Asing Jinarakita is varied according to the personal capacity and karmic circumstances of the practitioner. Finally, the outermost circle that you see over here is culture or Buddhaya, which makes one form of Buddhism seemingly different from another. In terms of practice, Asing Jinarakita encouraged a non-sectarian mixing of doctrines and liturgy. He preached that Buddhists should not become fixated on a single sectarian practice and should not consider another approach to be wrong and inferior. On a personal level, Asing Jinarakita kept the Theravada precepts of not handling money and not eating after midday, and he maintained the Mahayana practice of vegetarianism. According to my interviewees, he did so to bridge the Vinaya practices of both traditions. Later in the 1980s, Asing Jinarakita grew a beard to look like a Mahayana elder monk, but continued to dress in Theravada robes. From his appearance and his personal practice, it was evident that Asing Jinarakita wanted to stress that he was neither a Theravada nor a Mahayana monk, a combination of both. Following the 30th of September movement in 1965, Suharto became president and ushered in 31 years of authoritarian rule, known as the New Order or Order Baru, that lasted until his resignation in 1998. Suharto's government blamed Communist China for the 30th of September movement and for its influence over the Indonesian Communist Party, and decided to cut diplomatic ties with the People's Republic of China in 1967. The government passed a series of laws and presidential orders to assimilation aimed at Chinese Indonesians and emphasized the Panchan Silat principle of the belief in the one Almighty God, using religion as a force to counter ET's communist influence. To make Buddhism compatible with the first principle of Panchan Silat, Asing Jinarakita introduced the concept of Sangyang Api Buddha as the Buddhist version of an Almighty God. He claimed that the concept of Sangyang Api Buddha, which could be found in the Javanese Sangyang Kamahayanikan, a 10th century text produced during the reign of King Sindut from East Java. Following Asing Jinarakita's rediscovery of Sangyang Api Buddha from ancient Javanese texts, he mobilized his disciples from various parts of Indonesia to spread these ideas. However, Sangyang Api Buddha was a double-edged sword for Asing Jinarakita and his Buddhayana movement. On the one hand, the concept was accepted by Suharto's government, thus ensuring that Buddhism continue to be recognized to be one of the recognized religions in Indonesia. On the other hand, some of Ating Jarakita's followers became critical of his theistic explanation of Buddhism and broke away from the Budayana movement. In my lecture, I have explored the history of Chinese Buddhist migration, settlement, integration, and networks in the 20th century through two main themes. The first concerns the attempt to write a connected history of Buddhist communities in China and Southeast Asia. The other explores the role of Chinese diasporic monks in the making of Buddhist modernism in maritime Southeast Asian states of Indonesia, Malaysia, and Singapore. I conclude here with some directions for future research in hope that other more linguistically endowed scholars will pursue further studies on the connected history of Buddhist communities in China, Hong Kong, Macau, Taiwan, and mainland and maritime Southeast Asia. In the first place, the evidence of Chinese Mahayana and Southeast Asian Theravada Buddhist connection discussed in my lecture reveals that Chinese and Chinese diasporic monks were interested in going to mainland Southeast Asia to exchange ideas and learn from their Pali-oriented colleagues during the 20th century. That is, the South China Sea Buddhist networks linking the Chinese monks to maritime Southeast Asia have also kept Chinese Buddhists of Indonesia, Malaysia, and Singapore in touch with Buddhist institutions and monastics in Burma, Cambodia, Laos, Thailand, and Vietnam. There remains much to learn about the patterns of Buddhist circulations in the South China Sea and the ways in which modernist Buddhist ideas overlap with and perhaps facilitated one another. Another area deserving further attention is the relations between modernist Buddhists and pre-institutional Buddhist temples in maritime Southeast Asia. As we have learned from the case studies of three prominent South China Sea monks, modernist Buddhists sought to promote their visions of religious orthodoxy by setting themselves apart from pre-institutional Buddhist practices. There were Chinese Buddhists who participated and moved freely between modernist and pre-institutional Buddhist organizations without having to give up one over the other. Overlapping commercial, clan, and religious ties between the Chinese diasporic communities in maritime Southeast Asia may have made it difficult, if not impossible, to have a clear-cut separation between modernist monks and pre-institutional Buddhist groups. How did their collaboration or conflict impact the religious landscape in maritime Southeast Asia? Finally, the time period considered in my lecture, Chinese Buddhists fled communist China and supported anti-communist initiatives in Taiwan and maritime Southeast Asia. Some recent and forthcoming works have revealed that Buddhists became embroiled in the Cold War politics of mainland Southeast Asia. Yet little attention has been paid to the ways in which Chinese monks participated in counter-communist activities or to how they rely on South China Sea Buddhist networks to cultivate activists and collaborate with state actors and like-minded Buddhists during the Cold War. Examination of the writings of Chinese monks in maritime Southeast Asia, along with Burmese, Khmer, Lao, Thai, and Vietnamese sources from the mainland, could help construct a more comprehensive picture of East and Southeast Asian Buddhism during the Cold War era. It is likely that a further unpacking of the connected history of Buddhist communities in the region will help us better understand the flow of people, ideas, and resources that shape South China Sea Buddhism. And I will stop here. Thank you, terima kasih, and 谢谢.